Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 76th video in our Master Series and the 7th video in our Mixing Concepts. We are going to talk about, because I'm going to revisit some of the things we talked about in Master Series 66, Master Series 67, and Master Series 68. So I do suggest you go back and revisit them, but basically there's a couple different things. The first concept is when we're doubling tracks. And even if if we want things panned off to one side or the other, or not to add stereo field is, well, we'll talk about that first. Let's say you've got something you want to pan to the left. So you don't really want it on the right. Now, if you want to add stereo field, that you can duplicate that track that you have on the left, pan it over to the right the same amount, and drop the volume way down and put delay on it. Does that make sense? One of these multiples up here. Either that or work with the inter-aural processing that we'll talk about in a minute. That's very much a lesser amount of that type of delay work. It'll add less stereo field and less body, but it will still enhance the stereo field. That's one concept. If you've got one panned off right or left or whatever, to double the track and put it on the other side, pan the same amount and drop the volume way down. Just bring it down to where you're listening into the mix, you bring it up to where you're starting to hear it, and then back off on it. Does that make sense? And then put delay on it. Does that make sense? Either one of these multiples here, either one of these multiples, or work like we're talking about in inter-aural processing. Up to like 0.65 millisecond delay on that other side of the track that you duplicated, can add huge amounts of stereo field effect to your mix. You just got to be careful that, if you really want just the guitar over there and the bass over there, that if you get a lot of instrumentation going on, that technique can cause mud. But if you don't have a whole lot of instrumentation going on, that it can really add body to the mix, huge amounts of body, and just experiment. In some situations it will work great, and in some situations it won't, because it just starts causing too much mud. So you have to make a decision, and sometimes at certain sections in some production. So now when we had went through this, we were revisiting this because this is a real simple concept. We're talking about this inter-aural processing technique that, you take one track, and let's say you start out with the track, you've duplicated it, you've panned it all the way 100% right, 100% left. Let's start from there. And then you have, on the one on the left, you've put 0.65 milliseconds of delay on the one that's far over on the left-hand side. The one on the right, you've dropped the volume minus 0.5 dB. Does that make sense? Now, if you do that with other tracks, that as you bring it closer together, you subdivide this to less and less and less. That means, like, if you got it down to like it's 30% right and left, or 40% right or left, you have to get out a calculator, and it's pretty simple to divide this into 4, divide it into 5 levels or whatever, between 1 and 10 or something like that, and make it less as you come in. Does that make sense? And that technique, it basically is a delay effect in a very mild way that will definitely add stereo field and body to whatever you're doing. Even if you just got like a vocal and you don't really want to do a bunch of wild processing on it, but you've got it panned 50% right and 50% left. You've doubled the track, you've got it 50 right, 50% left. So you go minus 0.65 milliseconds, 50% of that on the left, that millisecond delay, and on the right hand side you'd have like minus 2.5 dB. Drop the level minus 2.5 dB, or minus 0.25 dB on the right hand side. Though sometimes you have to fuss with that, because I've found sometimes when I start dropping this level on the right hand side, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, just depending on how my ear is hearing it. Sometimes I have to walk away and come back, because I know the side the side that has a delay on it will sound quieter than the side that doesn't have the delay. That's a huge way to add some depth to your mix. That'll add stereo field and add presence, because it won't sound like it's doubled tracks that are static. They'll have different delays on it. And we already talked about it quite a bit in depth in those other 3 videos about also, putting different reverbs on them, EQing one a little bit different than the other, sometimes even sound sculpting one a little bit different than the other, or, not different reverbs, but adjusting the reverb that we've decided to use for our space, quote unquote, for the production a little bit differently so that it is a little bit different than the other one. That way it adds more stereo field effect. They're not so different that it's really noticeable, but just enough to where it is a little bit different that causes a widening of the stereo field. It's a huge technique. Now, extreme examples of that is, let's say that I have this vocal and I pan it, I doubled the track and I panned it 100% right and 100% left. And on the left-hand side, I put a 36.6 millisecond delay on. That's right underneath the effect where it sounds like it's doubling. It won't sound like it's going da-da, da-da. It'll sound like it's one hit. That's about max in my DAW when I'm sitting here in my studio that I can go. And this is something called the Haas effect. Now, as you come in, you want to make multiples of that less and less and less, subdivide that, the limit that you can go to, because you want to do it less and less and less as you come in. That will add huge stereo effect. I mean, it really, you sit back and you have that done like that, pan 100% right, 100% left. The only thing you have to remember is on the right-hand side, you're going to have to start dropping the volume level. And depending on what you have, the delay on the left, that you're going to have to drop. Well, you can see the difference here. You've got, about 0.65 milliseconds, and at 0.5 milliseconds, you've got minus 0.5 dB. So just figure out the multiples. Does that make sense? Because that's about 0.5 milliseconds, and, a little bit more, and that's, about -5 dB. So if you multiply that, you'll be pretty close. And then you might just have to adjust a little bit, because you'll have to drop the right-hand side down, the side that doesn't have delay on, because otherwise it'll sound louder. So your meters will sound like they're lying to you, because your meters will tell you the left-hand side is louder, but your ears will tell you, no, the right-hand sounds loud. The right-hand side sounds louder because you're hearing it first. So it'll immediately go to it, and then here's the left after it. I mean, just so fast you can't even hear that there's a delay, but it will perceive that the right-hand side is louder. So you have to really keep that in your mind. Now, this can go for like doing a bunch of guitars and stuff also. I mean, laying them out to where you've got, one of them panned, all the way right, all the way left, 75% right, 75% left, 50% right, 50% left. You got 6 guitars of the same track, and you just want a wall of sound. And you can put delays all over on every one of them and leave one of them with no delay, and put detunings on all the other ones, and it will sound like a wall of guitars for some break, like ba 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 ba, for some pop song or something, and it will sound like a wall of guitars. It will sound really good. And so, I mean, it's a very simple concept that you just have to experiment with. There's no really set way to tell you how to use it. I've figured out that I've subdivided the multiples of the point to where it starts to sound like it's doubling, and then put them into fourths and subdivide them into thirds. Sometimes I'll even go down into eighths and things like that, depending on what I got going on my stereo field. Does that make sense? And it's a really simple concept. So if you have 4 guitars, and you've doubled it 4 times to make this huge 4-guitar stereo field, it sounds like a wall of guitars. Bam! Every one of them are got a little bit of delay from each of the other ones on them, in some of these multiples, and detuned some of them. You've got minus 3 cents on one, plus 3 cents on one, minus 6 cents on one of the other ones, and it will sound like a huge wall of guitars. So that's a very simple concept that you very much just need to experiment with. And go back and watch those 3 videos, because we got a little bit more in depth into there. I just want to revisit it, because these delays, we talked about in that video about putting delay between different instruments. So let's say you did this on 2 guitars and you had them panned all the way right and left, with 36 millisecond delay on the left-hand side. On the bus that it's going to, you'd still want to put that other delay on that we talked about, putting delay on from one instrument to another, because it's happening after it. So in the process, all these intermingling delays start to add all this huge amounts of stereo field effect. You just got to really watch it as you start mixing things together that you don't end up with a muddy mess. But if you do a good job on it and you really pay attention to what you're doing, that sometimes you can get away with some really serious delays. Sometimes you got to break it, go down and go into some of these inter-aural processing techniques I talked about that are very little delays and reductions of volumes, because you're going to have those other delays on the buses. But it can add huge amounts of depth and width to your mix that just unimaginable what the effect that it can have on your production. So that's a very simple thing. The other thing is detuning. Now, the detuning that you can detune your instruments also. It's like you can have the guitars detuned a little bit from the basses, detuned a little bit from the keyboards, from the, whatever, in the vocalist. Just little bits of detuning because they're never really totally perfectly in tune. So, if you've got captured them live, there's probably some of that happening anyway. But if you're dealing with VSTs and things like that, and pianos and things like that, detuning them a little bit from each other can actually help make it sound fatter, make the whole production sound fatter. So really keep that in mind. And on your doubled tracks, it's a simple example as I've got that doubled vocal on the one that's doubled that I've got it set at -3 cents or +3 cents or -6 cents or something like that. I figure somewhere between 9 and 12 cents, reduction or addition, in change of the tuning. It won't sound like it's actually out of tune from the other instrument that you're trying to offset it from. And it's a huge technique, the detuning effect, because it adds huge amounts of body. It's just like we had talked about, that you might have all these instruments in here, and none of them, it's not real likely any of them going to be tuned exactly to each other. So you've got slight amounts of tuning, detuning, and uptuning, -3 cents, +6 cents, +3 cents, -9 cents, all over the place. That's adding this to this lushness of the sound because there's just a little bit of offset in the tuning. So those are some serious concepts that we wanted to revisit, and we'll talk about them a little bit more when we get into mixing. But we're talking about some mixing concepts that I want you to investigate on your own and experiment around with. So I do suggest you go back and watch Master Series 66, 67, and 68 because we had talked about this a lot in those videos, and so I suggest you go revisit them as you're going through this mixing concepts series. Peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.